Hello dear students, let us continue our journey with Unit 4's Module 37. And today we are going to discuss about ISLM model and the BOP curve. Now, for any economy, there is two more important goals, that is internal and external balances. While the internal balance thinks about 1. To maintain full employment which is consistent with frictional unemployment and a low level of inflation, which is mostly conducted by the monetary and the fiscal policy. Whereas the external balance requires balancing the balance of payment structure. While some country may deliberately have a disequilibrium in order to have some current account surpluses to have some benefits ripping out of it. But more or less, countries focus on maintaining an balanced BOP account. Now, more countries focus on internal balances, whereas external balances can also be focused with. In order to maintain equilibrium in these three zones, there are three important policies. One is the expenditure changing policy. Second, the expenditure switching policy. And the third is the direct control policy by the government. By the expenditure changing policies, the government have been using the fiscal policies and the monetary policies to control. In case of expenditure switching policies, the policies of change in exchange rate have been used through the policies of devaluation and revaluation. Now, a devaluation makes the import costly, whereas export cheaper, and help country to get some benefit of it. Whereas a revaluation increases the value of domestic currencies, causing a fall in export and rising in import. Third, the direct control measures by the government can be in forms of quotas and tariffs and may be a policy to restrict trade or improve the position of the balance of payment. We have three situations over here: the good market, the money market, and the foreign exchange market. How can equilibrium be achieved in all the three markets simultaneously is what we are going to study in this module. Now, to understand the internal and external balances, we are going to study the Mundell-Fleming model, especially in the case of a small open economy. Now, the Mundell-Fleming model is also known as the ISLM BOP model. We had earlier studied the ISLM model for a closed economy in Turkey where there was no foreign trade. The Mundell-Fleming model moves one ahead step and takes into account the foreign market as well. Now, the Mundell-Fleming model shows a short-run relationship in an economy for the interest rate, the exchange rate, and the output, which the closed economy ISLM did not look into. The closed economy ISLM mostly focused on interest rate and the output. Now, to deal with the Mundell-Fleming model, first we have one assumption that the economy is a small economy. That is, the trade behavior of the economy doesn't influence the world. The second thing that we considered is the perfect capital mobility for the economy. That is, the capital can freely inflow and outflow from the country. Now, this basically means that the rate of interest in the domestic economy is equal to the international rate of exchange, that is R star. Now, what will that mean? This means that this economy can sufficiently borrow and lend at a given rate of interest, that is R star. What would happen if R, that is domestic interest rate, greater than the international interest rate? In that case, foreign capital would flow into the country to take the benefit of the higher interest rate differential, and this will push down the domestic interest rate to R star. And vice versa, if R is lower than international interest rate, the money will flow out of the country to abroad till R is equal to R star. Now let's talk about the good market equilibrium. We already know that Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX represented than ISLM in an open economy. Now, the NX, which is the balance of payment or the current account, depends negatively on E, that is that amount of foreign currency per unit of domestic currency, which is the exchange rate in the economy. Mind you, it is negatively related because a rise in E will lead to a fall in export and rise in import. Now, net export can be related to the real exchange rate in an economy, where real exchange rate is equal to nominal exchange rate E into P by P star. The Mundell-Fleming model consists that prices abroad as well as in the domestic market is fixed, and that the real exchange rate and nominal exchange rate moves in the same direction and in same magnitude. Now, goods market equilibrium condition will then be denoted for R equal to R star as this particular equation. Y is equal to C, Y minus T plus I, R star plus G plus N, E. This equation will now be called an IS star because we are including the foreign market as well. Now we will be deriving the IS curve in this case. Look at the figure A. Suppose the exchange rate E goes up. A rise in exchange rate leads to fall in the net export in the economy. Now remember, net export is a part of the domestic demand as well. This leads to fall in the planned expenditure as shown in this figure B. A fall in the domestic expenditure leads to fall in the domestic income from Y1 to Y2. So what we find in panel C, that a rise in exchange rate from E1 to E2 leads to a fall in output from Y1 to Y2. And this gives us a downward sloping IS star curve in the economy, giving a negative relationship between E and Y. Let's go to the money market equilibrium, and here we are going to derive the LM star curve. We know the money market equilibrium is the equilibrium balance between the real money supply and real money demand. Now prices given constant, now it will completely be dependent on money supply equal to money demand in the economy. Now if we add R equal to R star as we have perfect capital mobility, our LM curve equation becomes MP is equal to L R star comma Y. Let us call this equation as LM star curve. Now we can derive the LM curve. Remember, our LM curve in a closed economy was an upward sloping, showing the relationship between R and Y. Now if we put R equal to R star for a given level of R, our LM curve will be a vertical line because the exchange rate does not enter the LM equation. Thus, we have a vertical LM curve with relationship between E and Y. Now we put both the IS and LM together and we find that equilibrium exchange rate will be given by this particular point of interaction between the LM curve and the IS curve. And we find for a particular value of Y and R, the economy is having an equilibrium income as well as the equilibrium exchange rate. Now let us have a small economy with a floating exchange rate. By floating exchange rate, we mean that the economy's exchange rate gets balanced by itself in the market forces due to changes in demand and supply. Now, Mundell-Fleming model will show how changes in policies under floating exchange rate is impacted under Mundell-Fleming model. Let us first start with fiscal policies. Suppose the government increases government expenditure or reduces taxes. What it does is that it increases the domestic demand initially. This leads to a rightward shift in the IS curve. In the diagram, if we see, given the LM curve, as the IS curve shifts, there is no change in Y, but the equilibrium shifts to a higher exchange rate. Now, why is this happening? We have to understand the impact of international flow of capital and how it impacts the capital flow in the domestic economy. Remember, the interest rate and exchange rate are the two important variables in this particular story. As the income rises initially, in the closed economy, the interest rate used to rise and is to change the money demand. Now this is not possible in an open economy. As soon as there is an upward pressure on R, there is a flow of capital from abroad trying to push the R back downwards to the equilibrium international rate R star. Now what happens due to this? As R begins to rise, there is an inflow of currencies from abroad. Now this inflow of currency means there is a rise of demand of domestic currencies. A rise in domestic currency means a rise in exchange rate for the domestic economy. That means E rises. With rise in E, now domestic goods become more expensive and foreign goods become cheaper. This leads to fall in export and rise in import, leading to a fall in net export and thereby killing away the expansionary impact of the government's fiscal policy. Now, why is this happening? So if you look into the money equation, P is fixed, money supply is fixed. As R cannot change R equal to R star, Y has to be at a particular level as that old one to maintain the money market equilibrium. And hence, we find that there is no change in Y in case of fiscal policies. Now what happens in case of monetary policy? Suppose the government tries to increase the money supply in the economy, and this can be seen by the diagram where the LM curve shifts to the right. A rightward shift in LM curve leads to a rise in Y as well as fall in the exchange rate in the economy. Now what is the mechanism behind this? Remember, although the impact looks similar to that of a closed economy, the mechanism is different in this case. In the closed economy, a rise in money supply used to lower the domestic rate of interest. However, this is not the case in an open economy. A rise in money supply will try to reduce the rate of interest R in domestic economy. This will lead to an outflow of currency from domestic economy to outside because that domestic people will try to take benefit of higher interest rate outward. Now, this will create a domestic pressure in a downward direction on a domestic interest rate. And now, the flow of domestic currency outward means there have to be a fall in exchange rate because people are now more demanding foreign currencies to invest outward than domestic currency. A fall in value of E leads to a rise in domestic demand and fall in import, thereby stimulating the total income in the economy. Hence, in an open economy which is small in nature, a monetary policy influences income by altering exchange rate. Now what happens in case of a trade policy? Suppose the government takes a trade policy by controlling import or by putting a tariff or a quota. How is this going to impact? Initially, we see that net export curve shifts rightward. This leads to a rightward shift in IS curve as well. The impact looks similar to that of a fiscal policy. Y does not change and there's a rise in exchange rate. But the mechanism is not that similar. In this case, what happens? As the net exponent component increases due to rise in export, due to fall in import, we have an upward pressure on Y, which in turn puts an upward pressure on R. Capital quickly starts flowing out into the country because the domestic R is getting up. This leads to an appreciation of currencies. The appreciation of domestic currency leads to a fall in export and rising import, thereby reducing the domestic income. Now this is the mechanism which shows that a trade policy which is used to restrict trade is going to not impact the Y in the economy. Now, what will happen if the economy is under a fixed exchange rate? A fixed exchange rate economy is one where the central bank is willing to take actions in order to control the exchange rate to a given amount. In this case, the central bank is willing to buy and sell domestic and foreign currencies to balance the exchange rate at a given level. And we are going to see how this is going to impact. Now suppose the equilibrium exchange rate in this diagram is at this particular point. In this case, it is higher than what the central government has fixed at this particular blue line. In this case, the central bank is willing to buy foreign currencies and sell money into the economy. This should push the LM curve outward. In the second diagram, where the domestic exchange rate is lower than the fixed exchange rate, In this case, the central bank is willing to sell foreign currencies, thereby reducing the supply of domestic currencies and reducing the LM curve to the leftward, thereby maintaining a fixed exchange rate in the economy. Suppose the government uses a fiscal policies by cutting taxes or by increasing government expenditure. As seen earlier, the IS curve shifts rightward. Now, this rightward shift in IS curve will put an impact on the market exchange rate, as you can see in the figure. Now, a shift of IS curve from IS1 to IS2 tries to move the exchange rate from this point to this particular point. However, the central bank is committed to keep the exchange rate fixed to this blue line. Now, how will the central bank react in this particular situation? As bank ready to have foreign trade in domestic currencies to at a fixed exchange rate, there will be a quick response by rising exchange rate. In this case, the central bank will sell foreign currencies to the central bank, and there will be an automatic monetary expansion. This monetary expansion will shift the LM curve from LM1 star to LM star 2. Look, at this particular point, we will have an equilibrium at a point where the exchange rate remains same. This is the case of the floating exchange rate where our exchange rate was going down. But in this case, we have a fixed level of exchange rate at this particular point. What would happen if there is a monetary policy? In case of monetary policy, suppose the central bank tries to increase the money supply in the economy, and this will shift the LM curve to the rightward. Now, the rightward shift in the LM curve, shown by this dotted line in this diagram, will bring the exchange rate down. Now, how will the central bank respond to this? Now, as this puts the downward pressure on the exchange rate, to maintain the fixed exchange rate of money supply, that is to a LM star, must be back to this particular point. And how will this happen? In this case, as there is a fall in exchange rate, the arbitrator quickly responds to this fall in exchange rate by selling domestic currency to the central bank, causing the LM curve shift back to LM star. In this case, what we observe that the monetary policy is totally ineffective if we have a fixed exchange rate system. By agreeing to have a fixed exchange rate, the central bank is basically giving its power to control the money supply in the economy. However, in case of fixed exchange rate, monetary policy can be seen in a different way. That is, the central bank can change the direction and level of exchange rate. A reduction in the official value of currency is called devaluation, and an increase in the official value of exchange rate will be called an revaluation. The Mundell-Fleming model says that a devaluation is the shift in the LM curve to the right and will act like an increase in the money supply in the economy. In the floating exchange rate case, which we said earlier, the devaluation will expand the net export and will raise the aggregate level of income in the economy. Conversely, a revaluation will shift the LM curve to the left and will reduce the net export and Y in the economy. Now let us take the case of foreign trade policies in case of a fixed exchange rate system. Now suppose the government tries to reduce import by imposing an import quota or a tariff. Now what happens in this case? As seen earlier, this will shift the NX curve to the right and which will impact a rightward shift in the IS curve. As we have discussed earlier, it is similar to that of a fiscal policy, but the mechanism is different. The shift in the IS curve tends to raise the exchange rate in the economy, as seen by this diagram, as the equilibrium moves from this point to this particular point. However, the central bank is committed to keeping the exchange rate to this blue line, which is fixed. Now, what will happen in this case? Now, the impact of a trade restriction in fixed economic system of exchange rate will have a totally different impact like that we had in a floating exchange rate system. In both the case, the trade restriction shifted the net export curve to the right, but only under fixed exchange rate system that the trade restriction will lead to a rise in net export as we seen in case of equilibrium. And this is because as a rise, the central bank will try to balance by shifting the LM curve to the rightward as if there is an increase in the money supply in the economy. The new equilibrium move from this point to this point, and there is a rise in Y from Y1 to Y2. So tariff on import quota shifts the IS curve to the right, and it induces the money supply in the economy. Remember, the rise in money supply from this particular equation, nx is equal to s minus I, indicates that as y increases, saving must increase, and to balance this saving, given the rate of interest I does not change, so nx must increase to balance with the right hand side. Hence, net export increases in this particular case. We can see the Mundell-Fleming model in one short summary, in both case of floating exchange rate system as well as fixed exchange rate system. What we impact? In case of fiscal expansion, Y does not change, but exchange rate rises. In case of monetary policy, Y increases, but E falls. In case of import restriction, there is no change in Y. However, there is rise in the exchange rate similar to that of fiscal expansion. What was the impact on net export? In case of fiscal expansion, net export has fallen due to rise in import and fall in export. In case of monetary policy, net export has increased due to change in the exchange rate system. And in case of import restriction, the net export is becoming zero. In case of fixed exchange rate policies, in case of fiscal expansion, Y increases, exchange rate and net export does not change. In case of monetary expansion, Y does not change, E does not change, NH does not change. As we said, monetary policy is totally ineffective in this case. And finally, import restriction, Y increases as well as NX increases. Now both this floating exchange rate system and fixed exchange rate system have their own merits and demerits and will be chosen by the economy according to their needs and requirements. We talk about one important aspect of the Mundell-Fleming model, that is the impossible trinity. Dear students, note that in the analysis of exchange rate regime, we have one important conclusion, that an economy cannot have it all. What do we mean by that? That economy cannot at the same time have free capital flows, a fixed exchange rate, as well as an independent monetary policy for the economy. And the fact, this is called the impossible trinity or the trilemma of the international finance as we call. Now, a nation must choose any two of these policies and have to give on the third one. We can have this with an example. The first option is that which was followed by USA, where the USA had free capital flow and had an independent monetary policy. But what we had to do is to allow the free capital flow and to have independent monetary policy. It was impossible to have a fixed exchange rate. That is, the exchange rate was floating in this country to maintain the foreign currency equilibrium in the economy. The second example was that of the case of Hong Kong, where Hong Kong allowed a free capital flow and had to fix exchange rate. But in this case, Hong Kong lost the ability to have an independent monetary policy. The money supply had to be adjusted to keep exchange rate at the predetermined level. That means here the nation fixes the currency to the another nation and adopt another nation's monetary policy. The third example is that of the case of China. China in recent year had interest rate no longer fixed with that of international interest rate. That means interest rate was domestically fixed. But in this case, it was that of similar to that of a closed economy. But this was possible to have a fixed exchange rate and have an independent monetary policy for the economy. Now, history has shown that a nation cannot choose all the three sides of this trinity at the same time. Every nation must ask itself the following question: does it have to live with an exchange rate volatility, that of as in option 1, or does it wants to give up its monetary policy control, that as in case of Hong Kong, or does it wants to restrict its citizens from participating in the world financial market and get the benefit of international rate of interest like that of China? The impossible trinity says that no nation can avoid making any one of these choices. Now, the entire idea of this impossible trinity can be seen with the help of this diagram. All the three examples, like option 1 where United States chose free capital flows and independent monetary policy, had to give up with the free exchange rate. In case of Hong Kong, who chose free capital flows and free exchange rate, had to give up with the independent monetary policy. And the third case, where the independent monetary policy and fixed exchange rate of China led to a different impact on free capital flows. So if you are taking advantage of any two sides of the triangle, you have to give up on the third side of the triangle. So dear students, in this particular model, we understood in a case of a small open economy, in case where there is free flow of capital exchange and where the economy can either fix its interest rate with that of the international interest rate, and how there is an impact of adjustment of exchange rate in the economy in case of floating exchange rate system, how different policies can impact the output, net export and E in the economy. Whereas if there is a fixed exchange rate system where the central bank is committed to maintaining the exchange rate in the economy, how the impact of fiscal policies, monetary policies and trade policies can change the value of Y, E and net export in the economy. Thank you, dear students.